and Homelessness, and Director Tina Curry. I'm going to give you the floor, and please introduce yourselves and your positions as you speak. Commissioner Carter, did you have a question first? Okay. All right, thank you.
Madam Chair and Commissioners. I'm Tina Curry, Director of Financial Assistance Services. And briefly, what we did for the Landlord Assistance Program. On March 23rd, 2020, Governor Walz issued an Executive Order 2014, which suspended evictions in Minnesota. On September 4th, 2020, the Centers for Disease Control signed a declaration ordering a temporary halt to residential evictions nationwide. Landlord Assistance Program provided one-time grants up to $20,000 to landlords for lost rent and late fees. Applicants had to have lost rental income due to COVID-19 between March 1st, 2020 and December 30th, 2020. Eligible landlords included individual or sole proprietors, corporations or limited liability companies, and nonprofit housing developers. The first round of funding focused on small landlords with less than 50 units, and the second round was for all other landlords and small landlords that did not apply the first round. I will now turn it over to Supervisor of Evaluation, Dana DeMaster.
I'm Dana DeMaster. I'm the Research Supervisor for Health and Wellness Administration. And I want to keep this one short. It's a small program, and I think the housing and homelessness, there's going to be a lot going on there. But it does complement well some of the emergency assistance, emergency general assistance things we were talking about earlier this morning. This one, how it was evaluated, we looked at the application data from landlords who applied. We did an online survey, and of the landlords who, we only got 126 responses. So it was a fairly low response rate, so we're not quite as confident in some of the results of this one, so just be aware of that. We also invited 45 landlords who were randomly selected to focus groups, but only 11 responded. And so again, this isn't, interpret these results with some caution. We didn't get as much, information as we would have liked, or as broad of information. But the questions we asked, are Ramsey County landlords and renters better off as a result of this program? And so we were able to provide $8.2 million in support to 626 landlords with just over 2,200 tenants. So that's in terms of we're thinking about the EA and how many people received support there. This is not an insignificant number of tenants in comparison to the EA. And in the survey of those who responded, 78% said that they were better off due to this assistance, but there was some specific concerns I'll get to in a moment that, this didn't solve their problems or solve their financial issues.
And if I could just interrupt, I know we all use acronyms and they get to be such commonplace for us, but EA is Employee Assistance, so, Emergency Assistance, excuse me, you're right. Emergency assistance. Well, yeah, it's a lot of things. It's a lot of things, but in this case, it's emergency assistance. So thank you. I'm glad we clarified that. But if we can, at least at the beginning, give the acronyms what they are.
And so another question we had was, was the rental housing, what kind of impact did this have on the housing market or the rental housing market in particular? And did this prevent default for landlords on their mortgages or loss of their properties? And so, like I said, that this was a smaller program, and so the landlords who received the grants definitely benefited, but there wasn't an overall kind of impact on the housing market. It was much too small for that. And as I said, that most landlords said that it helped them and that they felt they were better off. They had concerns about not only ongoing future rents, but maintenance and utility expenses that weren't necessarily covered directly in rent. And especially as some of the heat prices and things like that rose over the winter, some of those ongoing concerns. And we asked also about the health of their business and kind of their future outlook on how things would be going. And just over half said positive or very positive, so 55%, and 30% said, no, this is negative. I don't know that I should continue in this business. And there was a number that, even though 80% said they'd continue in the rental business, there was quite a few who were concerned about their ability to maintain as many units. And so someone who maybe owned 5 duplexes was like, well, maybe I'll sell off 2 of my duplexes and just keep these 3. And so that was kind of the concerns there. Did we serve the people most vulnerable to COVID-19? And as you've seen in some of our other presentations, we've compared data to the Social Vulnerability Index from the Centers for Disease Control. And so here we use the tenant addresses and then geocoded them to the Social Vulnerability Index. And 62% of the tenants lived in areas with high vulnerability scores, and 19% lived in areas that were just considered vulnerable. So this is lower than the emergency assistance, emergency general assistance programs, but still kind of within that realm of, you know, more vulnerable areas. We didn't get any information from the landlords on their tenants' demographics, and so we can't say anything more about the tenants themselves. However, in terms of the landlords, the number one response to most of our data on their demographics was prefer not to answer. So we don't really know much about their demographics. Yeah, I think 40% when we asked race and ethnicity said prefer not to answer. But we know a bit about their business. And so 98% were not nonprofits. They were other types of business arrangements, the most common being sole proprietors. And so when I think about who we often partner with, or when we talk about who we're talking with landlords, we're often working with nonprofit developers who might offer other services. But here, the response really got into those who this is their job, you know, and 41% had 5 or fewer units. And so to Commissioner Montes-Castillo's question earlier, are we just benefiting landlords? This is benefiting landlords, but 41% of them have a property or 2 or 3, right? So it's not necessarily all the big companies. On the other hand, an equal proportion also had more than 50 units. So you had 40% on the very, very small operation and 40% with the big operation, and then 20% spread across the middle of that. And so really, we're able to get to some of those landlords that, you know, this might be their 1 or 2 properties that they have. What did we hear? We asked them, like, in the focus groups, how can Ramsey County be a better partner with landlords, or what happens post-pandemic in ways that we can continue to work together to support housing stability? And, you know, like I said, only 11 people attended these, but they had a really rich discussion. There's a lot of confusion about the eviction moratorium, and one of the quotes on the following slide, they're talking about that. And so many of the landlords thought they couldn't evict anybody for any reason. And so although that you couldn't evict people for non-payment of rent related to COVID, if someone was having illegal activities or severe property damage, there were ways that you could still evict someone for those types of lease violations. And what we heard from landlords was they didn't know that. And so there was significant confusion about, like, what happens when it expires, what are the terms, how can, you know, what happens for their businesses. They also said that we asked, like, okay, so most landlords knew about emergency assistance. Like 62% of our survey respondents said, yes, I'm aware that this exists for my tenants. However, it's really difficult, they're talking about, both in the survey and in the focus group, when someone isn't paying their rent, they avoid their landlord. And so getting paperwork for this was difficult. But also getting paperwork for something like, or telling your client, emergency assistance to the county, you should go apply. It was just really hard. And they were also talking about in the focus group, they used the word restorative process, but basically that this whole experience of the pandemic and the moratorium and the income loss had set up this really negative dynamic. And it was interesting in the focus groups when we listened to the recordings, whether it was a small landlord with 2 properties or it was a big landlord, which we had some of the big landlords attend the focus group, they were both talking about how there's become this, like, almost antagonistic relationship of just a circle of bad communication and, like, kind of finger blaming or finger pointing at each other. And, like, they wanted some way to get past that, right? Like, we want good tenants. We want people to be housed. We want a stable source of income. How do we get out of this dynamic? And so that was some of the things they were talking about going forward, which sort of our recommendations are pretty light on this one because of its size and the kind of sketchy data. But I wanted to call your attention to that landlord voices in the middle there, and that's what they were talking about. The eviction thing is a really, really big deal. I mean, we've had a couple of tenants that need to go because of issues, and I mean really big issues, but we can't evict them even on that. And so we're looking at starting to sell most of our houses in St. Paul. And I'm not a lawyer or a housing lawyer, but I'm betting the things that they were describing were things they could have evicted for. And so that kind of speaks to that confusion as a whole. And so our recommendations are pretty light on this one and kind of reflect the same things we saw this morning. Some of them, remember this was written back in March, and so the emergency rental assistance program that Tina spoke of this morning was still being created and worked on, and so there's some recommendations for that. But landlords wanted information about about community and county resources that would go in like a lease packet. And I think when I think about our workshop last week, and we were talking about the role of the county as a convener, I don't know that these are recommendations for us so much as our role as a convener, or that the space where we're able to bring different community groups together. So where is that information for landlords so they can know about things like emergency assistance or food shelves? But also this, with the step down on the eviction moratorium, there's deadlines there where people need to apply for things, and if they don't, they lose some significant protections. And the landlord can apply on their behalf.
Great job. Oh, sorry, yeah.
I'm sorry, just on the point
Commissioner
that you
Carter.
were making there, there are certainly recommendations for us around that last point in the landlord voices, if in fact we're doing emergency assistance, to make certain we're coupling that, with linkages at that level, rather than just referring the landlords, and I don't know if I see that there.
Oh, yes, Commissioner Carter. That the last quote there for the landlord voices is the concern, some of what we're talking about this morning, like where is government doing good versus where are you creating, like the landlord is concerned if people are getting these resources, how are we not creating dependencies on these resources in the long run? And so how do we, is that a lift up? Sometimes in a true emergency versus an annual thing you apply for and consistently budget for. So,
But just the point that even if it is something that is being applied for at that point, the linkages, how can we think about linking that application to information about additional avenues for building longer-term support? I just think that's a stop on that, and how do we figure out, how we connect them back in to our service centers, to employment services, to other resources that may be about their sustainability long-term.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. I think that's an excellent point about, like, this is a point at which we're having a communication. And I'm not sure if landlords get a notice about EA that's separate, but that, that's another touch point, right? To be saying, here's information on these services, including the ones that are the longer-term, employment assistance, childcare, things like that. And then finally, in the terms of the long-term, is really engaging, will follow up well with the homelessness, but that working with landlords, including the small landlords, which I found are more difficult to reach, right? They're not necessarily active in a multi-housing association or through some landlord professional groups. And so, but those are often the people who are housing many of the people we work with and have some more affordable housing. And so how do we continue to work with them on those designs? And noting that this program was the first time we've done this kind of direct assistance to landlords. And so is that part of the solution? And I don't know, there's a lot of unintended consequences, and this is a small program, so not really feeling safe to draw any deep conclusions about that. But just thinking carefully, can we support landlords without, what are those unintended consequences of pushing those market levers? And then that concern about the breakdown in communication.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Mattis Castillo, and then Commissioner McDonough.
Yeah, you just mentioned briefly about communication, and I assume you worked with our cities on who has landlord licenses and then did a mailing. Is that how you reached landlords, or what was the process there?
Commissioner Marcosilo, that is correct. We got a listing from the city of St. Paul with all the property owners, the landlords.
Got it. Thanks.
Was it just St. Paul?
Well, we leverage their list as well as the listing we receive from Housing Link. Mhm.
No, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Was this assistance offered countywide, or was it just office?
No, the
Okay.
assistance was offered countywide.
Okay.
Okay,
I'm
okay.
sorry, I thought you were asking about a list.
Yes,
Not-
yes, I was asking about the list, but I think
Okay.
it was confusing just the
Okay.
way you answered. Yeah,
Okay,
perfect.
thank you. Commissioner McDonough?
Thanks, Madam Chair. Two questions or observations. First one maybe being more of an observation and really kind of trying to help again this policy that we have to get our hands around and budget, right? You know, representing the east side of St. Paul, and I've lived there my whole life, I've watched the east side transition from, 90% home ownership to like 80% rental. It's close, right? And I've watched the impact it's had in our community. And, I'm I don't want to support landlords where they can just put money in the pocket and they're not adding value to the community, right? But landlords are a big piece of adding value to the community and helping support people we're trying to help. And sometimes the biggest impact is working with the landlords, right? Rather than individuals, because then they stay supportive. And a couple of things on this. One is I appreciate, because I remember having my concern is to stop them from just walking away with the money was, this, you can't evict because we're helping them and we're helping you cash flow so you don't lose your property. But, this, 40% own 5 or less and 40% own 50 or more, and I don't know what the 50 are. Are they big apartment complexes or are they 50 houses, right? And here's kind of the piece that's happened, and I know all of us have rental, and it's not different, but what happens when the landlord that owns 1, 2, or 3 decides to get out, somebody in Palm Springs, Denver, or Florida buys the property and adds it to the other 100 they own in our community and never invest a penny, ever. And it just gets worse for us in the community. And so that's why I feel strongly about, as we develop things into the future about what's our best investment for dollars and that return on investment and how do we help support people, we've got to be able to stop this shift from local ownership, because this communication thing will even get worse. You know how many times I had to ask Joanne to try to track somebody down in Denver or Palm Springs or Miami to talk to them about their property because it's an issue? You don't think the tenants want to talk to landlords? I can tell you what, the landlords don't want to talk to county commissioner offices. So I do think that, that this is one area that we have it, and we responded because emergency assistance grants weren't getting utilized. So it's like, how do we get out there and help so we don't have the eviction cliff? How do we help support landlords so they don't lose their properties? And so it was kind of a new area, and maybe it's an area we grow on or expand. I'm not advocating for it, but there are good reasons why, because how landlords invest and take care of their property not only impact the people living in them, but they affect the surrounding community, right? And then the other, so that's more of an observation you guys can weigh in, and it's way bigger than the evaluation, but it's part of it. And then the other piece, and I didn't see it in here, and I don't know if this was a part of the evaluation, but I bumped up against an issue, got really contentious. Because one of the landlords had applied and got rejected, right? And I actually had a legislator call me and say, why, right? I mean, this guy's, so then we reached out, we talked to folks, and folks said, well, there are all kinds of red flags that this wouldn't pass an audit at the federal level. And so, and then we kept going back and forth. And even the more documentation that this fellow sent caused more red flags, right? That, there's a potential here that could get us in trouble. So we had to deny, but it was a contentious. So I guess my question is, how much evaluation did we do of, say, like those denials that were either potentially, and, I don't want to accuse fraud here, right? It could be fraud, or it could just be a lack of capacity to understand or be prepared to be responsive, right? He just didn't have the records we were hoping he could provide to document that he had the issue that we should be helping him with. So it could have been either one. Did we do any evaluation of that component of this so that in the future, maybe we don't have people slipping through the cracks that shouldn't, on either side, right? That where there's potential for fraud or where there's the potential people aren't getting help because the sophistication or capacity for them to be responsive just wasn't there.
Madam Chair and Commissioner McDonough, no, we didn't look at that. Part of the reason was this was put together just really quickly. And so in terms of like the SharePoint site we were running to keep track of just the applications themselves. But I think going forward, if we were to continue or to consider some sort of ongoing landlord, program, getting to your first comment about those small landlords that live in the community versus the venture capitalists that are currently buying up swaths of our neighborhoods, if there is a place for that, hopefully we wouldn't be developing it in an emergency and would have more time to look at some of that.
Good work, thank you.
Thank you so much. Commissioner Ortega.
My question is, I share Jim's concern, but I have sort of the flip side of that coin. But just to get to Jim's point a minute, I have quite a few friends that are small landlords. So just in social conversation, because on a social level, these people are basically my friends. They're maybe in their 40s and they own 1 or 2 homes and maybe a smaller apartment building or 4 buildings, so forth. So a lot of the issues I am concerned about them because the point that Jim brought up, they're invested in the community. They own their own homes in the community. We don't want to lose that. We got other issues then. So that's it. On the other side, so here's what I get from a lot of their conversations, and I'm not saying that they're the same group of people, but and that is, so now with the housing market the way it's going, I could swap tenants and still be in the sense of, I mean, the difference. So if you look at, if I had a tenant that they were paying $900 a month, right? And now the housing need is so great that, people that are paying, and you know better than I do, $1,400, they're not making a lot of money. So now my big fear is that we have some kind of, I don't want to label people, but, if it's their business, and I'm saying, I'd rather have Victoria than Jim.
Which is fun.
I knew that was coming, Raphael. You looked around the table, you looked right at me.
That now we have and this is not even a race thing, within one community, you have choices that might not be as fair as, it's not an open market anymore. And so now I'm going to be making, because I want to get off the dime of us against them. The landlords are not the bad guys necessarily. That I don't buy into that rhetoric. And we got to look at what happens within some of the old communities where people are into survival about their properties. And how do we make sure that that everybody gets treated in a fair way, or at least we keep the system from going too much out of whack.
Yeah, wow. Okay, so Commissioner Carter, while you're thinking about that, Commissioner Carter.
Totally totally understand that, and I know that as we talk about landlord assistance, we're thinking about that in this regard. There are a lot of other places where we can be thinking about that as we contemplate our economic development systems. And, I just think that there is something by way of small landlord assistance that we should be thinking about, because so many are having difficulty maintaining properties. Some are aging and unable to on fixed income, and so that I'm not prepared right now, but I know that we are thinking about in our development strata, how we can help people to stay in our community, that be residents, that be landlords. And so I think this goes even beyond, far beyond just our rental assistance or landlord assistance programs. Thank you both for bringing that up, because it is critical that we're able to keep the fabric of our communities. And as properties become scarce and rents increase, we stand to lose that fabric. And so affordable housing and, the development of that affordable housing makes sense, but also looking specifically at how we assist those who may be having difficulty and who have so much to offer to us in terms of the longevity of our community. That's also important. So I'm looking, directly at Joanna and knowing we will have opportunity to hear from you more about that as well.
Thank you. Commissioner Reinhardt and then Commissioner Manis-Castillo.
Well, and I think that this really leads into the fact that it's too bad we didn't do the HRA levy earlier.
We
But-
tried.
But I
We
do
wanted
think,
to.
yeah, I know, but, well, and you know what? We needed to have the right time and people understanding, and
How
they do, even though it's still difficult because of change and all that. But, the naturally occurring affordable housing obviously goes into rental units as well. And I do believe that there is a way that we can tailor it in making sure that we get those investments in the housing, not just giving you money to stay there if it's not where it needs to be. So and the only reason I say it, I'm sorry we didn't get it done earlier, is because we can't do this stuff until 2023. And it's like, okay, but we are going to be ready to do it. And so that gives me hope.
Thank you.
Well, and
Commissioner
I was just
Manis-Castillo.
gonna add to that is actually we did last year, right? We put 300,000 of the Greater
Yeah.
Minnesota Housing Fund to
Absolutely.
preserve affordable housing. So when those rental units become available, they partner with investors that will keep, local investors that will keep it affordable. So, yay, good work. This is a reason for it, for the economic development team as we move forward.
Absolutely.
Yes, great work. You can tell there's a lot of passion around this issue at this board, and we just appreciate your work so much. If there's no other comments, lots of notes, because we have lots of work that we want to continue to do. Like someone said, it's the start, this is the beginning of this work. Commissioner Fretham.
I'll just say one thing.
Yes.
I would love to see, maybe from the Housing Stability Office, some thought put into what is something we could do around restorative practices? If that's if that is something that can help people house, how can we partner with some, maybe other areas in our agency that are doing things that are restorative to look at what role we could play, even if it's just connecting to other community services. There is community mediation available. So that, I think that presents an opportunity, even if it's just a list of websites of, here are some local places if you want to try to work it out.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Okay. Commissioner Carter, you're okay, okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. For all of your evaluation.
Hard one.
Now the long one. Thank you so much. We really appreciate all your work. And we just look forward to many more conversations and workshops about this great work. I'm kicking All right, welcome. Thank you so much for hanging in there with us here. And we, of course, are very, this is an area that we're all really passionate about. And so we appreciate your work. And so if you want to, you can, or did anyone want to start, County Manager, or do you want to you can just lead us off here? Why don't you just lead us off?
Madam Chair, I'll just say,
Yeah.
this is a piece that's instrumentally important as we build on where we're going with a department that's standing up off the ground that didn't exist before COVID. Today's a good checkpoint. We can talk more about where it's going now, but it'll be a big part of the budget conversations in the fall and beyond as well.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Okay.
Thank you, Madam
And
Chair.
just we're on the record, you're going to want to introduce yourselves and what your departments are for when you speak.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, fellow commissioners. My name is Keith Lattimore. I'm the Director of Housing Stability, and wanted to talk to you a little bit about what we did with homelessness during COVID-19. So, taking a step back, we all realized that there was some hurdles that our current Shelter systems were facing with the eviction, well, not the eviction moratorium, but obviously the social distancing that was set by the CDC guidelines, which required them to reduce capacity in their facilities in order to make space and be in compliance. So Ramsey County stepped in and set up some emergency shelters. And also, we wanted to also make a respite opportunity for those who may come down with COVID that were in shelters so they can have a place for respite and it wouldn't contaminate the current shelter system. We also wanted to provide some adequate temporary shelters through use of hotel space, which we contracted with several hotels. And we also, several other leases in order to create that opportunity for those individuals to leave their current shelters and come into the temporary Ramsey County shelters for, during this COVID pandemic. And so, we did that by, obviously contracting with the shelters and expanding some additional space so we can keep our bed space adequate as we were faced with, a growing number of encampments that were out there and those who were unsheltered, as well as those who were actually in shelter already but still needed to come inside during this pandemic. We also wanted to provide service for, those carve out some space for what we saw as a deficiency in our current system, and making sure that there was place for women, there were places for couples, and there was also places for our LGBT community. So we wanted to make those spaces available. So those are many of the things that we did, among others, but for this point, I'll turn it over to Joseph to go into further details.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Commissioners. I'm Joseph DeSenclos. I'm a Planning Evaluation Analyst in our Research and Evaluation Unit. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity for us to share the outcomes of the hotel respite eval. Before I begin, I'd like to point out two of my colleagues in the back, Mark Hursfield and Jessica Journey, who are senior program evaluators and were extremely instrumental in crafting this evaluation, along with Amy Blair, who I believe is in the Housing Stability Department now, but she was an incredible resource for, getting accurate numbers on connections to benefits and housing. So first I want to start off with, this is, whoop.
Go back.
Yeah. Oh, this is much easier. I'm going to plant the seed here with housing navigation. This is our really high-level view of the benefits in housing navigation. You'll see throughout this evaluation just how instrumental those resources were for folks to get connected to benefits and also into housing. So starting back in June, we connected with AmeriCorps and got 5 benefits navigators. Their contract ended with us in September, so we saw this gap. Then 66 community providers were approved, and so we continued these resources. And as you'll see throughout this evaluation, we were informing the operations about red flags that were popping up for us, and the county was able to fill those gaps. In January 2021, SOAR, the acronym is Social Security, or SSI and SSDI Outreach, Access, and Recovery. It's an group that works with connecting people to Social Security benefits, and the outcome rates or approval rates for folks who use SOAR is far better than if I would go in and fill out an application for somebody. So these were really key to having these navigators in the shelter, and as we heard from folks when we did our interviews, having people right there on site to walk through sometimes very, very complex bureaucratic paperwork.
Is there,
Yes, Commissioner Mattis-Castillo.
is there a fee associated with SOAR's work? Do we pay for that? Is it a contract?
I don't know. I'm going to defer to maybe Keith, if you're aware of that.
I'm not aware offhand, but I'm.
Okay.
I believe there was
Okay.
some kind of MOU or I'm just kind of reflecting on
Sure.
our meetings. I believe there was a MOU.
Is it a state or a federal? Yeah,
That's,
That's a state,
okay,
organization.
Okay.
okay. And Commissioner Carter and then.
Quick note to connect the dot between, this assistance and financial services, to the extent that if those resources are available earlier and can be utilized to help people prevent loss of housing, we're in a better position. So just a note there, that's a.
Very good point. Very good point. So that's just the, kind of the high level, overview. Well, we started off, the evaluation wondering, how's the hotel shelter program and respite program working? And as good evaluators, we came up with these evaluation questions, which you'll see throughout this presentation. They'll be answered in slides. But the gist of it was, who is experiencing homelessness, and were we able to prevent exits to homelessness for folks using the hotel program? Also, connections to wraparound services, which we'll discuss. We also wanted to take a look at how the unsheltered population was supported during the pandemic, and then who used respite and to what extent testing was available. So throughout, like I mentioned, throughout this project, like as we were digging into these questions, we were looking at data and maybe seeing some red flags with certain things, or even when we began our interview process with the 49 folks at the shelter, we'd hear things that we'd bring back to our operations group, and it was really interesting to see how a large organization like Ramsey County was able to be flexible and pull in the partners and that we've been working with, that we've had long-term relationships with, to really fill those gaps. So it was very, very impressive to see. And then also, you'll see on the next slide, we took a look at administrative data, some of our internal systems that we've discussed already, to really take, monitor and track outcomes and identify gaps, see where we needed to, maybe change direction, things like that. And then we also had a COVID hotel shelter or hotel respite dashboard that was updated weekly. So we were continuously monitoring this program. So as I mentioned, how this was evaluated, we used administrative data. The Homeless Management Information System is a statewide system along with Maxis, MinChoices, NextGen, and other public benefit databases. And it's very important. So for this evaluation, we were only looking at people who entered between March of 2020 and December of 2020, and who stayed in our shelter program or quarantined for longer than 7 days, because there are folks that will come in and they'll leave. So we didn't want to go out and reach out and ask, how was the shelter? How they couldn't find them. But we wanted to have people that had stayed at the shelter for a period of time. And then we wanted to, go beyond just looking at the numbers and really understand how people were supported. So we went out and interviewed 49 residents at the hotel shelter between November and 2020 and February 2021. Part of this process was we wanted to have them, we were going out to reach out to them. We connected with 2 residents at the hotel shelter to help us work through the questions before we went out and started, interviewing people. We wanted to get their feedback. It's called a talk aloud session, and just kind of get their reaction. Do we need to change language or anything like that? That was conducted prior to going out and evaluating folks. So what did we learn? Who experienced homelessness? What we found, we found that the people that were experiencing homelessness were obviously people that were homeless before the pandemic. We also found people that were impacted greatly by the pandemic, either by job loss or they were precariously housed and had to leave. We met veterans. We met people that were labeled essential workers, and they were staying at the shelter. So we had folks that were there that were earning an income that disqualified them for benefits, but they could not afford housing. One other key thing that came out of this evaluation in terms of who experienced homelessness was that we had women were served, or the hotel shelters served a higher proportion of women than their general population. And when I say our general population, we compared our point-in-time data. It's called the PIT count. It's done every January, of last week in January, and it's mandated by HUD. And it's just a one-day count of who's experiencing homelessness. So we took a look at, we used that data to compare, and I think we had 931 folks on our 2020 point-in-time count, and compared that with the demographics of the folks that stayed at our hotel and respite program. But women they were moved from our Catholic, or from Catholic Charities to the hotel shelter program to make more room in the shelter for men. One thing that we have currently is existing is a gap for beds for women, especially women without children. So that was one key finding that we discovered in this evaluation. Then we, as I mentioned, we wanted to compare, the clients entering the hotel program compared to the 2020 point-in-time data. And as we see here, whites and African Americans, it's pretty comparable to the point-in-time data. Asian Pacific Islanders and American Indians access the shelters at a lower rate than their point-in-time. Some kind of thought maybe because the population was smaller or they found other resources, but we don't know. Next, we wanted to see, one of the key things is preventing people from exiting to homelessness and ensuring that folks had housing stability supports. So 176 people.
Madam Chair, excuse me, yeah, Commissioner Reinhardt.
Going back, sorry, the clients entering compared to overall homeless population. This morning we heard about basically the difference in cultures with Asian, Latinx, American Indian being more family focused or friends and family focused. Is that what this is showing us here as well? Or don't we know?
It could be. I mean, we did a needs assessment of the entire homeless service system in 2020 and found some similar kind of themes around that, around culture, just cultural differences.
Yeah.
But the information that we have, we can't really draw any conclusions on why people didn't access the hotel program.
Thank you.
So.
Okay, thank you.
So next, we wanted to prevent people exiting to homelessness. We wanted to make sure they got connected to housing. We had a pretty robust goal at the beginning of this project, considering it was a pandemic. People were having trouble finding rental housing. They weren't even showing apartments, and we wanted to, we hoped that we'd house 100 people. So during this evaluation period, we ended up surpassing that goal by 176 people who entered some form of either supportive or subsidized or unsubsidized housing. And then to date, or as of July 13th, 2021, this momentum has continued, and we've housed 350 people either in some kind of subsidized or unsubsidized housing program.
Can we pause there and just celebrate that for a second?
Yeah.
Good to you, yeah.
That is a significant increase
Yeah.
from previous pandemic when I think the rate was around 3% that would
Yeah.
get stably housed out of shelters. So
Yeah,
congratulations to your team.
yeah. Thank you for calling that out. That's,
Yep, thank you. Key to this was, as I mentioned, the housing support program. Also, housing choice vouchers and the elder program at Catholic Charities was instrumental in achieving these housing numbers. We took a look at the data based on race, and we took a look at the largest groups by race, African Americans and whites, and they were equally likely to be housed. Older people were more likely to be housed than younger people, and we had some assumptions. Maybe it was because of how the state or the protocol and policies around people over 62 or 65 years old getting into the or getting into the hotel program, that may be. So, next, we wanted to take a look at, who is housed by race and ethnicity. And, Hispanic and Latinx people, were housed at a higher rate. The total, percent average, you can't see because the picture's in the way, is 27%. So when we took a look at African Americans and, whites, they were at the average, there's 27 percentile. And we also wanted to take a look at housing, by age. And, the people 40 and over, were connected to housing more so than the younger population. We don't know why, but that's another area that we need to explore. There's some work being done. We did a evaluation or a research project on housing support services for younger people experiencing homelessness that we provided with the Housing Stability Department. We hope to kind of build upon that and maybe answer that question.
Thank you. Commissioner Carter?
It just occurs to me that I'm not really sure I understand what it means that they entered housing. Does that mean they entered a permanent housing program? Or does it mean that they secured housing?
Good question. We grapple with that all the time. How we looked at it is people were referred into housing. And we don't know how long people stay because they could go take a look at the place and go, no, I don't want to stay here, I don't feel comfortable here, and leave. But these are people who received referrals to housing and obtained housing.
So they received referrals to assisted housing or subsidized housing or?
Yes, good question. It could be subsidized housing or a subsidy that someone could take with them to like a private landlord or something like that. So
okay, but they received housing support of some sort.
Some sort, yeah.
Is there any data on whether or not any of these people entered independent housing arrangements?
I'd have to dig into that. That'd be a follow-up question that I'd get back.
Because I would consider that a real success.
Yeah.
And so how we're tracking could make a difference in how we're observing the successes. I don't know, that would have happened, but it would be real helpful, I think, to have knowledge of that. If there's any way we can capture that.
Very good.
That's far more difficult.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Reinhardt and then Commissioner McDonough.
I noticed, and you can't see it up there, but I got a printed copy here. Basically under 40 is so much less. I mean, so do we know what happens to them, or are there other issues, or what do we know about that group? Because that's pretty significant when you have 10 out of 73 and 20 out of 170.
Well, I mean, research shows, and this isn't exclusive to Ramsey County. My colleague Mark and I were on a call with HUD, just thinking about CARES dollars and supporting youth 24 and under experiencing homelessness. And there's a common theme, I think, across our country is why aren't youth accessing our systems? But what we hear from when we interview youth is like, I'd rather go to a place that's more community-based and it doesn't look like an institution. Or there's a bias around being homeless and being a young person. So they will couch hop, they'll be sleeping on the train. They might not look the stereotypical homeless person with a panhandling sign or something of that nature. So it's a bigger question that I think we as a country are trying to solve. So,
Commissioner McDonough and then Maniscalco.
Yeah, thank you. To Commissioner Carter's question, and because I've been involved in this so long, and moving somebody into independent housing would be huge, right? But the fact is, most folks on the street need mental health services or chemical dependency services. They just need a lot of support. So moving them into the continuum where they're getting housing with support, and a lot of times that housing is time limited. And, the hope is they get stabilized enough to move to the next step. But to your point, and this is kind of like where the HRA, I think, is going to be important in the conversations in the future, that independent living at 30% without support is critical to stopping people from ending up on the street. So we've got this flow of folks on the street, we're trying to get into housing, but we're also trying to stop people from ending up on the street. So that housing you're talking about, without supports but independent living, investment in that really stops people from getting in. Because right now, almost all our 30% affordable housing has some type of support to go with it, which a lot of folks don't need. They just need the financial piece to keep them stabilized. They don't need anything else. The essential workers that are in our shelter, right? They don't necessarily need the mental health or chemical dependency support, so.
Yeah.
It's both sides of the street we've got to kind of intercept.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's the youth solution as
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
So many of our youth are, they're turning 18, they're aging out of foster care, and there's no place to go that's affordable. I mean, we have a huge problem with housing for youth. I think we can all acknowledge that, and this demonstrates that as
And
well.
the piece I'd add though, and this is what happens, our youth disappear because they are trafficked. They're preyed upon.
Yeah.
And I mean, within minutes of showing up at the Mall of America or downtown, these predators target them, and they get to them before we do, right? And that's the piece that is even more complex with the youth, because these predators get to them before we can, and then they're lost. I mean, we can't find them. They know how to keep them away from us, because that's what they're doing with youth, and it happens to youth much more than the other population.
4 key areas from our youth report were around supporting parenting youth, more shelter beds for youth, this concept of host home programs, which is operating in, I think, suburban Hennepin and Hennepin County, along with non-time limited supportive housing. Because oftentimes, we have these restrictions on how long people can stay or income requirements, and that just doesn't necessarily match up with what a young person is dealing with to get to self-sufficiency.
Lots to do. Oh, yeah, lots, okay, thank you.
Next, we wanted to take a look at to what extent were people able to access wraparound services. And going back to the first slide, benefits navigators and housing navigators were key to this success, along with monitoring the data as we went through the evaluation. So what we found were 77% of shelter residents had their financial benefits started or renewed once they were in the program. 67% had general assistance or supplemental nutritional aid program. But we discovered that only 5% were receiving medical assistance, and it was just astounding for our evaluation team, like in the middle of a pandemic. There was some kind of suggestions around a policy or a form that someone had to fill out, or the people had to fill out to kind of confirm information. But we discovered that like really late in the process, and we'd have to do further evaluation on that. Right now, it's just an assumption. It's not anything, take with you at this point. But it was concerning for us. So it was key to have our benefit navigators connecting with people. We heard from one person who said, having the benefit navigator knock on my door at 7 o'clock at night or in the evening after dinner was really helpful. I was ready to sit down and go through that paperwork. 24% were open with Ramsey County Mental Health Case Management and Stabilization Services, and that department was beneficial not only within the hotel shelter program, but also helping to, support folks that were unsheltered. So 217 folks were not receiving benefits at entry, and 41% were approved for benefits as they were in the shelter as a result of this navigation. And then African Americans were more likely to obtain benefits after entry. And of the 431 people already receiving benefits, 95% had renewals done while they stayed in our shelter program. And that's huge. If you think about the bureaucracy that we've talked about today, having those numbers or those percentages is just outstanding.
And we have a question here, Commissioner Reinhardt.
The issue that you discovered late in the process regarding MA and it being only at 5%, was that corrected?
Well, as a result of, having navigators there, yes, people were people were connected to MA.
But
But that was the one thing that we were like, whoa, what's happening here?
was it something about citizenship or something like that?
We didn't hear anything on citizenship. Like I said, later in the process, we heard about some form that somebody had to fill out, but we don't have any concrete, that wasn't a part of this evaluation. It was just
Okay,
kind of.
and I guess what I was wondering about was the form, because there must have been something about it. Because if you are in need of medical assistance, that's kind of basic. And if you chose not to because of a form, it'd be nice to know what that form was to see.
Well, some of the I guess there was a time limit, like you had to have this
Oh.
amount of time.
Oh,
And then other things, I mean, we heard this in our interviews where people, they don't pick up their mail on a regular basis, so we found this isn't within Ramsey County, this is, another organization that, takes care of folks' mail, like, they're not checking their mail on a regular basis, or their address has changed, they haven't updated their stuff, so there's many things around communication, but like I said, that's just speculation. At this point, we'd have to like dig into that, do some more research around that, to take a look at the numbers to see if this form and these rules or policies, impacted people, getting disconnected from.
well, and it's just so striking, that's how come I thought if there was something about a form that, needed to be brought to people's attention to say, is this really necessary? Maybe it was, but, it would be interesting, and clearly, if you are homeless, having someplace to pick up your mail,
Yep.
not easy.
Right. I just have a quick question. Can you just clarify, the benefit navigators are separate from our other navigators, right? And they've been, how long, or are they the same? We have benefit navigators, but we have these other, like, community navigators that are out in our resource centers. Are they the same?
Well, in this purpose here, the benefits navigators, they were, trained by our staff, contracted with us. The AmeriCorps folks were supervised by our staff, with training. And then the other providers, many of them were already doing benefits for folks. So when the AmeriCorps contract ended and we had that gap and we ended up getting 6 different providers to help with benefits navigation, many of those folks were already doing that in their daily work.
Okay, so, but the community navigators that we had, like, that were in our libraries and different things.
Yeah.
Yeah, Dana, just curious.
Our navigators under enterprise services
Okay,
started going out to the shelters, I believe in late December, early January, and now still go to Capitol Ridge weekly, as well as at, Catholic Charities St. Paul Opportunity Center. So the navigators that Joseph was referring to in the beginning, they were the AmeriCorps, and then later on, our own navigators started to fill that in,
okay,
and are currently going out there as well as other shelters.
okay, so they are,
I think that's
Yeah.
good.
oh, I'm sorry, what did you say?
I've contacted vendors also that are in the shelters permanently right now.
Okay,
That's the overuse of the word.
yeah, yeah, I was just wondering how broad that use was, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Then finally, one of our questions was around, how did the county help support, like, when we talk about wraparound services, like culturally specific wraparound services. And what we heard from most of the people we interviewed was, you folks are doing exactly what I expect you to do. I'm in a crisis. It's around, finding shelter and support services and things like that. And maybe talk about my cultural needs later. So there was some disconnect around, even defining what a culturally specific, service was. But that's an area for further exploration. So hotel residents' voices. One person right away said if you had a pulse, they're going to talk to you about housing.
Love it.
Why not?
And then you look at the data and you're like, I guess this person's right here. And then also, like, housing vouchers, just having staff there, these navigators there, other staff there to help connect the dots, for housing applications and referrals. People talked about how much they got accomplished. Having a room where they lock the door, they don't have to worry about their phone and ID being stolen, and they can start moving from survival mode onto ending their housing crisis. So those were really key, and it was kind of echoed throughout our interviews.
Great.
So how well did Ramsey County help support the unsheltered population? The county obviously created staff and the infrastructure and worked with community partners to help the unsheltered population. And it was really key, really, when we interviewed some of the providers, they talked about the existing relationship Ramsey County had. They talked about, the sheriff's department being there from day one, delivering food, 150 to 250 meals, also providing transportation to the shelter. So when it came time for shelters to be kind of cleaned out or emptied out, there was already this built-in relationship with our staff. The outreach workers did a lot of work at the very beginning with this ever-changing, if you think going back to the pandemic where you'd turn on the news in the morning and in the afternoon there'd be some other protocol. But they were going out, making sure folks had hand sanitizers and updated health information, and also provided transportation. See here, we had our partnership with the City of St. Paul. They were very helpful in a lot of the environmental stuff and waste management, and they already were working with Ramsey County and our outreach providers to really kind of track which encampments were active and which ones were inactive. And then we did discover some issues around when we wanted to depopulate the shelters and then move people to the hotel program. And we heard early on that, folk from the unsheltered providers, that there was a barrier around people having to stay 7 days in the shelter before unsheltered people moving into the hotel shelter program, because there's a lot of ambivalence in the unsheltered population for various reasons. It could be environmental, it could be safety issues. We heard many women talk about just not feeling comfortable going to shelter or even accessing services during the day. So we kind of landed on this, but found out more information just recently around, when you're moving people from an unsheltered location into our contracted hotel programs cause many issues, damage to property and other things, which we had, Mr. Lattimore here and others had to kind of work that relationship with our hotel partners, and we developed this kind of vetting thing, which I think is right and just, and it's about ensuring that folks have access to the shelter, but also, folks can have access to the hotel program, but we have to provide those supports before we move somebody into a hotel room, because the silence can be very loud.
Commissioner Carter.
Just a quick comment on that. I know that by the time you got to Capitol Ridge, you had worked through that. And the reports back there were that we had guests at Capitol Ridge who were more respectful, who were more cooperative in the hotel than the regular guests, were. And so congratulations to you in working through a very, very delicate but important process at that point in time. Our reputation for management of those sites, staff from Ramsey County, and working with community was just stellar. And I thank you so much for the work you did there.
Keith Lattimore and also Max Holthusen and work.
Yes.
Okay, Commissioner McDonough.
Thanks, Madam Chair. So just kind of I'll get on my box here on this slide, because I think this is really important, and I think we can see how things played out a little bit differently between Minneapolis and St. Paul, and then Ramsey, right? St. Paul, and I appreciate our partners in St. Paul. They took a position that no one should be unsheltered. We are not going to have encampments, and I know there's advocates in the community that advocate for encampments. It's a part of the continuum. I would argue highly against that. But I think we've seen it play out, right? Minneapolis, in some respects, took that, right? Their parks, they were actually designated spots. We've seen Seattle and Portland when they say, yeah. And so this is the most difficult population for a lot of the reasons you talked about, but we can have the successes that you've called out. But this is an area where we just cannot let up on, because the unsheltered homeless, there's just no way we can ever say an encampment is an acceptable solution as a part of the continuum here. There's just no way around that. And we'll get pushback from advocates that say no. And we know there are people that are really difficult to house, but that should not alleviate us of the responsibility to find a solution for those individuals to be safe at night and during the day.
Absolutely. I have a question. We had AMC had a conference, New Commissioner School across the road here at the hotel. Why am I spacing out on the name? But yeah, I'm sorry, what? Yeah, the Intercontinental. I knew it was an I word. And there were just some issues at night from one of the people that were staying there. But we're not housing anybody there. So I told them, I said, well, that's tenants. I mean, that's guests. It's not any of our guests, not any of ours. So I just wanted to confirm that, because I think people are quick to, when they hear you're doing that, when there's issues, and we know that that's not always the case, because we have examples where our residents in hotels were really respectful. So, okay, I just wanted to confirm that. I had told them I didn't think there were.
So, Madam Chair, one of the things, obviously this is very difficult work.
Yeah.
And I think that we learned some valuable lessons early on, specifically around when we have a place, we put people in it. And there was really no vetting of who those individuals were. And we learned some valuable lessons early on last summer, when the Intercontinental and our DoubleTree Hotel from downtown here said that they were severing ties. And I think you probably recall that, we had to go back to the drawing board and really think about how do we put people in places that, that's going to give them the best opportunity to succeed. And those were some things that were made around screening individuals first, and then giving them kind of the step-up part of our program. It was more acceptable for business owners, specifically when those contracts end, that the hotel community spoke highly about what the issues were. And there were some reluctant to allowing us to come in, so we had to make some adjustments. And there were some difficulties in that. But I think we landed in a place where we have good operations. We have good measures in place. I think that has helped us be more successful. And I think it's given us, obviously, our partners in those hotels, obviously they have, had great experiences, been able to, obviously maintain the contract with us. And so I think those are some of the things that Joseph is speaking to around earlier on versus where we are now.
And I might just take this opportunity, Director Lattimore, of the great job you are doing. I think it's one of the most exciting things I talk about in my district is our Housing Stability Office that you're managing, and we really appreciate all that work. And I will say that she's in the past been a critic as Representative Alice Hausman, but she now speaks glowingly of our efforts to house our homeless, and this is a big deal. When you've got the chair of the Housing Committee in the legislature to talk about the efforts that we're making. She really loves to talk about it in the community, because I'm in a number of community meetings with her about our naturally occurring shelters. She loves our naturally occurring affordable housing, but she really appreciates the efforts that we made to have shelter space available for people. So just wanted to give you those kudos, and hopefully you've heard it from her as well. But she's a big fan now of, and I'm going to credit members of this board, Commissioner Manis, because you have people working with her on all of this. So, and thank you for your work with her, and she's very appreciative of the effort. So thank you.
Madam Chair.
As are we.
Thank you for that. We have a great team.
Yeah.
A lot of them who are not here, but I'm sure we'll pass that message on.
Thank you.
That's an excellent segue into the outcome.
Okay,
So,
great.
During the pandemic, we had
I just wanted to say it in regards to the hotel thing.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's, yeah.
our community faced social unrest with the murder of George Floyd.
Yeah.
So the unsheltered population we were concerned about that many of them were camping in places where there were protests and things going on. So Ramsey County community partners, and especially the work of Keith and his team really kind of smoothed out that process to get people from the unsheltered encampments into the shelter, emergency shelter. So by February of 2021, 239 people were referred into shelter from an unsheltered location.
Wow.
Next, we're going to move on to the satisfaction survey portion of this. And once again, we interviewed 49 shelter residents. at Capitol Ridge, Como, and Bethesda, and Mary Hall. So we asked about, your access, how was communication in terms of like your access to shelter? Most people like understood, like, outreach workers would share with them how to get into the shelter, what do you need to do, or other service providers. Others discussed, maybe posting information or advertising information would have been a little more helpful. And this was outside of Ramsey County. This would be like at a nonprofit shelter, like if they could post information up. We didn't dig into that to see if they did that or not, but those were some recommendations there. And then other people had issues, or not issues, but they rated it somewhat clear. Because they had, the services or access or things like that didn't align with their work schedule. So there's some things like that. Like I mentioned, we had folks that were essential workers doing some kind of work at that time. Then we wanted to know about health and safety at the hotel. This is where we heard the residents just talk about the heavy lift that Ramsey County was doing. Adjusting to these protocols, social distancing at a large shelter, even though we depopulated the shelter, just the lift around that. They talked about, most people felt very, very safe, but areas where they had concerns or somewhat was just around, maybe there should be some more supports for folks who have some kind of ongoing behavioral health or mental health thing, or just inability to kind of, follow those, or a medical condition that might, they might not want to wear a mask for some reason. But those were some of the areas. For the most part, everybody was feeling safe. There were no major concerns in that area. Getting into the hotel, once again, that's, access to the hotel. They talked about advertising more. Some people, could use their phone or something like that, but a lot of it was just word of mouth. But advertising more in terms of how to get in. There was, I think, a couple people we talked to might have had some confusion about the age thing, and I guess seniors go to this hotel and I was supposed to go to this hotel, but just being a little clearer around that. But all in all, very good results in terms of the communication. And once again, client voices. This slide here, I've been doing this work for about 17 years. I understand, I ran 2 outreach programs in Minneapolis. I understand the depth of training that is suggested or required for social work. And then I also realized that the county repurposed people from areas that weren't technically like a human service thing. What we heard was, people I get treated like a regular human being here. A regular human being here. People were dealing with all kinds of things. We asked a question around, what were you worried about when you first heard about the pandemic? They were dealing with homelessness. Now there's this airborne illness that could kill them. So there were some trust issues going on, but we had staff that took the time at various times of the day and night to develop trust with folks. And that was huge. Someone said to me a long time ago, change happens at the speed of trust. So we had staff who, like I said, might not have been trained in social work, that were doing just this basic human connection with folks that was really instrumental in terms of our outcomes for housing and other services. And then one person mentioned that, the staff don't treat this like a job. The people come with passion to do the work. So heard many good things. These are just a few that we pulled out from the client voices, but it really resonated. So who used the respite program during the pandemic, and then, was testing available? So we were working pretty closely weekly with our public health department, getting numbers, and then Minnesota Community Care, they were doing pop-up testing things, and we were hearing about different events that were happening around testing. So we found that in April and November, the respite population peaked. We took a look at, who was using respite by race, and 42% were white and 34% were black. So that African-American population was underrepresented in our program. We don't know why. Maybe they, didn't want to get tested. I don't know. Native Americans, they're about 6% of our homeless population, so they're overrepresented in our respite program. And then, more than 3/4 of the people staying in the respite program were tested. So, taking a look at, so 195 people had symptoms of COVID-19 and 47% were tested positive. So we wanted to, people, all in all, people felt supported, they felt safe in the respite program. They thought the safety protocols, the people checking in on them, on a regular, staff checking in, that was very comforting to them. One area was when we needed to create more space at Mary Hall, which was like our quarantine, and there was not a lot of options for us, and we ended up landing on Boys Totem Town. Some people felt that it felt like a jail, because it used to be our juvenile facility, and rightfully so. Others, they said the grounds were beautiful. Others were concerned about shared bathrooms at, our respite locations, and some found that kind of stressful to deal with. Other, things around safety, let me double back. Many talked about seeing staff cleaning on a regular schedule throughout the pandemic was very reassuring to them, like wiping down doorknobs and cleaning up. That really helped with their overall sense of safety around the pandemic.
Madam Chair.
Commissioner
I
Maniscalco.
just want us to highlight and not forget that statement about Totem Town. It's why we closed it, because we put kids in jail. But early on, sorry, I always get emotional about that place because it's terrible. But early on, so many people said, just put all the homeless people up there. And I know Jim and I fought it for a really long time because we said it's a jail and we need to respect people and their dignity. And I think this calls it out. And so I want us to not forget that as we think about what's happening at Totem Town in the future, is that it is not an appropriate place in the condition it is today. So, thank you.
Thank you. The building serves no purpose
No
for
purpose.
anything that we do.
Nothing.
Well, I'm going to review the short-term recommendations, and I'll pass it over to Keith to wrap up with the long-term recommendations of this evaluation. So I'm just taking a look at the short-term recommendations of this evaluation. We'd encourage the continued support of creation of new affordable housing and supportive housing units. Definitely need more Section 8 vouchers. And operating a 24-hour shelter with individualized rooms, because we saw how that really helped impact people's ability to connect to other services. And then assign staff to work on housing and services like we've seen in this evaluation. And additionally, expand on-site services at shelters around mental and chemical health. A lot of that was drawn out from the interviews of the 49 people that we interviewed. That was their recommendation. And then also housing programs that help people who are working or receiving unemployment and only need financial support. Another recommendation from the folks we talked to.
Check.
Just a check.
Okay. Continued use of the housing support program. The connections with the benefit providers, I believe, brought in about $470,000 to the housing support program to help support more people that are going through that program. So that's key to that as well. And also, getting people connected to housing through the coordinated entry direct referral process. And then, as we saw, we'd like to increase the number of people on medical assistance, which looks like we have things in place now to achieve that goal. And because 5 to 6% of clients were on medical assistance at the time of this evaluation. And then the key thing to this, like the important takeaway from medical assistance, is that medical assistance is like the avenue for other benefits. It's the avenue for ending homelessness and being connected to other programs, along with just the health and well-being of that person that we're serving. And I'll pass it along to Keith.
Yes, and on that note, I think that one of the long-term recommendations first is that can't be our continued model. I think having to only come through one platform up here in Ramsey County to say that you get services is something that we have to work on. So that's one of the first long-term goals I'd like to speak to. And in saying that, I also wanted to thank, this county board as well as our county manager and our deputy county manager as well for first establishing a Department of Housing Stability. I think that, one of the things long-term is that, although we're a new department, I think one of our callings is to really coordinate those services. And I think the service team that you place this department in is so suited that we can have, obviously, great relationships with some key components in order to do this work. But also, just looking at our other Ramsey County partners as a whole, so we know that we touch people in every facet of the departments that exist here. And through those different services that they provide to those individuals, if a person is homeless, seem like they shouldn't have to come through another door in order to get services. So we wanted to make sure that we bridge that, and we believe that the Housing Stability Department is where that work can happen. So first, thank you and kudos to this board for seeing that and recognizing that this department was greatly needed. So, and that I thank you. As we look at some of the long-term recommendations, we wanted to prioritize data quality and timely data entry. One of the things that we have from our continuum of care, we know that managing our data is one of our measuring points with our HUD score that actually have been mediocre, more so than, being, good. And we found ourselves actually losing dollars because we're not, really paying attention or putting the services there. And I'm hoping that as housing stability, is formed, we know that we can do work by better managing the data, reporting out services, and helping our partners use our HMIS, which is a system that really, governs kind of how Ramsey County Continuum of Care scores in those areas. So we need to boost our scores, and I think that that's really relevant as a long-term plan, because ultimately, we're leaving dollars on the table and having reductions in dollars as opposed to increases. And so we can't have that because in the end, our residents lose when we don't pay attention to those services. So that's one of those that we want to be more careful about and be intentional about how we move that work forward. When I talk about that conduit and that, housing stability being that kind of centralized services, I'll just reiterate, not just in, our service team. We want to also, my 2 decades here in this county, 2 decades were spent in health and wellness. Well, before it was established health and wellness, that team. So those relationships, they're also important to make sure that we are partnering with public health, social services, and all those other community corrections when folks are leaving our institutions, that they're coming into housing. And that's work that we can do while they're in, or those release plans are in place that we can have that work done. So to me, that's where we have to be. I'll also speak a little bit about our housing and wraparound services need to be a part of the design of a shelter program. Some of you have heard before from my years in community corrections about our our JDAI work that happened. And I've taken pieces of that, as I was reminded by our county manager, who kind of reminded me that he's heard this before. But we talk about a highway to housing. And as we recognize a highway to housing, we believe that a highway gets people from one point to the next. Some people need to travel further along than others. Some people need to make pit stops along that highway to get to their destination. I see this as really our highway to housing as we talk about having all of our county departments along that highway and having individuals as you come on an entrance ramp that someone is evaluating all of the services that you need. So it's not that you pass off one person to another and it gets cumbersome for them and they don't want to tell their stories over and over again. We want to be able to have them have somebody, navigator, I know we've thrown that word around today, of some sort, but someone who can take them by the hand, say, here are the things you need from your evaluation, and I'm going to take you along this highway and stop you at every building along there, whether it be a department of public health, whether it be social services, whether it be, whomever along that highway that we have here for Ramsey County Services, and stand there with them while they get their information and take them to the next place until they're able to exit that highway. That is really what we look at when we talk about long-term goals. And so, the department, again, will serve as that conduit, really, to have that relationship with our other department heads to make sure that we have that continuum in place for our residents coming in. The other thing is that, as I mentioned before, they shouldn't have to come through one entrance. We want to be able to say, hey, if they come through Veteran Services and we find out that there's housing, they do that handoff to us, and then we take it from there to get them down that highway. So that's my kind of painting my picture to say that these are long-term goals and how we get from point A to point B. The next bullet, actually, before I move to the next bullet, we also need our partners there. I think, but we can control what we can control right now. This is Ramsey County, and there's no need for us to have to go out and not be able to work with one another, departmental-wise. And then through our continuum of care work, we also need our partners at the table, too, to provide those gaps where county can't do it. We can't do it all, but we can really, strengthen our relationships with our community partners to move them along that highway so we can have them there as well. The third bullet, implement standards, operating procedures, and provide training for staff to ensure consistent levels of care. And I think that kind of speaks volume. We were intentional about, making sure that we had individuals at the table who had lived experiences and those who just had a desire to work with, during this pandemic. This was great. And I think we can use that momentum to further along, as we get down the road, because that was one of the key things, I think, in our residents who didn't feel like they were unvalued. I think we brought people in who could resonate with the experiences that they had been, and many of them looked like us around the table. Some who had jobs just wasn't able to make a meaningful income in order to maintain those jobs, or our housing issues were there. And that's why I think the service team, where the housing stability is placed, work with our, CED, our, Community Economic Development in that department, as well as being able to strengthen and grow income, which is another one of our measures in our continuum of care, and partnering up, with our workforce solutions team. That's why I think it's so brilliant, because those are two really ingredients in order for us to have sustainability. As we talk about housing stability, we need to have that sustainability as well to keep us going. Finally, the final bullet is examine disconnect between Ramsey County advancing racial equity policies and the hotel shelter operation to promote more culturally responsive service models. So we've heard some things today, and we talked about like landlord support. And I want to also, mention that some of our landlords, we tend to focus our contracts, our policies, our communications is to the big landlords. And some of them might be in, maybe some suburban areas to say that this is what we have, take it or leave it. And I think that we have to shift our approach to this. There are some mom and pop shops. Commissioner McDonough spoke to those who are invested in the community. And sometimes our practices hasn't always wrapped around those individuals and given them opportunities to come to the table and be supported. And I think where the gap exists is that some of our residents, they want to be close to their community. They, so an option maybe to move out away from their family support, away from their cultural connections, away from their, we talked about this babysitting and that network of services and parents and friends and church services, even ethnic foods. That doesn't give them those same opportunities to be doing, that when their opportunity exists somewhere, in an area that's outside of their circle. And although we want to continue to offer that to them, many of us, if we got on our health partners today and you were looking for a provider, a medical provider, it'll ask you if you want someone to speak your own language, someone who might be a male or female, and offering some choice. And that's really where we want to get to. And so those are some long-term goals as we look at how we move forward, how we continue to move down the road of this highway. And those are things that I'll leave you with today. And when we look at our St. Paul Opportunity Center, we want to start looking at that as a service center. And so that's really our place where we want all of our partners at the table there. And we also, ultimately, our goal is to have it where we serve everybody, even women with children. And, right now it's kind of focused on single adults. But what about families? Why can't they come there? And I think that we have to push and challenge and be able to try to expand where we are already doing good work and just expand it a little bit better. And that's gonna take leaders thinking a little bit outside of the box and having some risk involved to say we're gonna do some things differently. And so those are just some of the things that we talk about, long-term recommendations and thoughts along how we get to where we need to be. And those are things that I'd like to share with you, our board during this workshop. And obviously, we'll close with those comments, and if there are other questions, I'll turn it back to you. Madam Chair.
I'm just gonna say thank you for all of your work. Just a couple of comments. St. Paul Opportunity Center, we hope that expands to the suburbs. I mean, I know it's called the St. Paul Opportunity Center, but we just have to be careful of the words we use, because we know we want to give love to the entire county. And, they feel it when we say that. So, and you mentioned the highway to housing, and I would say that housing is the highway to sustainability and thriving in our community, because we know that it's the basis of all of our residents doing well is stable and safe housing. So the work that you're doing is crucial to all of our work. I love that you've commented how great it is to be a part of this great service team, and I know that you are a great service team, and it does connect with all of our other service teams. But I love when our models are affirmed on such a grand way. And so with that, just thank you for your continued work, and we just appreciate it so much, and we look forward to the work that we're going to do together from now on. So with that, thank you so much, and thank you for staying this long. Thank you. Did you want to say anything more?
No.
Okay.
No,
Sorry.
I
Yeah.
want to apologize to you. This clearly should have been a workshop.
Exactly. I felt
know,
bad
and I
that
was
we
trying to
made this.
feel that I